Just before I get going, actually, while Ashley's presentation is still in your head, take some notes for later on, because we'll put him on the hot seat and blast him with questions. If you don't have any, otherwise I'm going to blast him with about 12 or 13 questions. Alright, so let's get stuck in here. Good start. Okay, so this is what I'll be talking about today. Minimising hamstring and adductor strains in team sports. I spell minimising with an S, so obviously you can tell where I'm from here. I already have to apologise about this because once I agreed to this topic of discussion, I realised how big it really is and how broad both muscle groups are. So the majority of this presentation is going to be hamstrings. Just because that's kind of the heavy hitter, and I'll talk about why in a minute, but that's going to be the majority of this conversation. But it is relative to all team sports. I want to make sure it is all team sports. I currently work in soccer, football, but I wrote team sports because everything carries over. If you're coaching anyone that runs in a linear way, then all this information should be applicable to you. So just before we get started, my background is not as tiny as Ashley's, but obviously from Australia as well. There might be one of our biggest commonalities there. And then made my way over here, legally, by the way. So I came over here as a young boy, played soccer in college, decided to go back, tried to continue playing Division 3, realised I was garbage, and started coaching at a variety of clubs. Before trying to make the leap of faith over to the States. And like I said, I made that leap of faith not knowing anybody. Just bought a one-way ticket and a green card that I got off eBay. And then came here and worked at a private facility up in Boston for a little while. And I learned from Dr. J right there in the white polo, pick his brain later. Then moved over to Purdue University for a short period as an intern. Coached at the University of Louisville, down to Orlando City, which is a soccer club in MLS, and then finally over to Houston Dynamo, which hopefully I'll stay here for a touch longer, but this is my first season here. And then accredited strength coach through every organisation listed there. Okay, so obviously like I said, what we're talking about today, again, team sports, you see it in almost every single sport. With running and acceleration and essentially anything. So I wanted to address that and the importance of that. And obviously you can see the individual burden on these guys' faces. This one's a heavy hitter with me because I was there at the time that happened. And that's a player that was on $7.3 million a year, so that was not good for my reputation. But I'll talk about that. Very quick video. I like this one a lot, as bad as it is.
Well, not necessarily the Cy Young. Into left center field. Starlin Castro strikes for
so this obviously, ball, there he goes.
The
so a couple of things to note on this, because I'll talk about it later. Watch his hand in a minute here, where he grabs and what he does, because this is the important things of what I'm going to be discussing on an intricate level. So he's got his right hand out there. So just note that, just for future reference, once I start getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So this is obviously, I'm not a baseball guy, but everyone knows the Yankees and Red Sox is probably one of the most biggest rivalries in baseball. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there's a guy, Castro, who was also on $7 million a year. So you break that down, if that's a grade 1 or grade 2 and he's out for 2 to 3 weeks, for example, you could probably play 12 to 14 games minimum, which is $41,000 per game, and the club's going to lose upwards of about $600,000 just based on that, which I'm going to talk about is probably maybe a preventable thing because he only ran a little bit there. There's obviously a lot of different variables going into that, but I'm going to start diving into that a little bit. If I start talking too fast, because I'm going to start belting through slides in a minute, just put your hand up and I'll take questions along the way because I know I can mumble and I talk funny. So I just want to address this before I start getting into kind of the epidemiology stuff, because this is important, especially if you work in high performance. And what I mean by that is high performance isn't just about getting the best out of your athletes, it's about getting the best out of organisation. And when you're with top level or pro organisations, you have to deal with GMs and head coaches and things like that. So when we talk about return to play and dealing with players and keeping them healthy, you got to know that the higher ups have this in the back of their mind, and that's why I keep mentioning the dollars, because it's easy to watch an NFL game or something and someone gets re-injured and you say, oh, how did that happen? They brought him back too early. It's easier to point from the outside, but on the inside this goes on, and maybe the GM and head coach start to push these practitioners to get them back faster, right? But the stuff that I'm going to talk about is how to bring players back faster, also in the most safe and efficient way possible. But this one's a huge one for me, baseball, because I just showed that video. Over 15 years, Major League Baseball players lost $7 billion in wages due to injury. So that's a huge one. And again, I wanted to address that because people in the room work in a private facility that maybe don't have that sense of pressure, but some of this stuff can certainly apply to you, right? So the background of hamstring injuries, like I said, I'm going to mention a lot of soccer studies and reference soccer a lot because that's my bread and butter. So this was a great, fantastic study done longitudinally over 13 seasons of UEFA teams, so a team in Europe, and rate of injury with hamstrings across each season. As you can see, and that grey line is just a smooth average. So as you can see, there's a roughly a 4% increase each year. So I think this is a fascinating illustration because there's more and more research and evidence surrounding hamstring epidemiology, but still it occurs, and if anything, it occurs at a greater rate. So it's a fantastic thing. I mean, not fantastic, but a fantastic visualization of that. So obviously, therefore, hamstring injuries are the most injured site in terms of football players, soccer players. So a lot of the stuff on reference is of course surrounded around that. So again, I'm glad Ashley brought it up, is we start with why. Simon Sinek, straight from the book. So if you haven't got that, buy it in the break. Start with why, and then obviously talk about the hows and whats. I'm going to flip those and go from why to what and how. So I'm going to break actually this presentation down into 3 parts, starting with why do hamstrings occur, and talk about the abundant of variables surrounding that. But I'm really going to dive into 2 or 3 of what I would consider low-hanging fruit around that. But what do we know about hamstrings? What do we know about injuries? What do we know about the mechanisms of the posterior chain in general? And then how? That'll be the heavy hitter stuff, the practical application. How do we apply some of this evidence-based criteria in a high-performance setting? So let's crack on. First part, why? Obviously, like Ashley said, starting with why is incredibly important. So this is another graph done of 7 years of soccer in England in the Premier League. So don't use a GPS. If anyone uses GPS, it's pretty straightforward, but number of high intensity runs for each position every year. And these are just based on games, right? So as you can see, the first group there, the strikers or attackers, there's that pretty steady increase every year, and it's only going up. And that just really carries across with every position, right? So for me, that says, okay, one of the potential causes is the speed of the game's growing. The technical aspects of the game are growing, the demand for physicality is growing, which means the training needs to be there and the preparation needs to be there. And this could be one reason of why there's more and more hamstring injuries, because the speed of the game's getting faster. I can't really comment on other sports, maybe Billy can mention this with NFL, but certainly in soccer the speed of the game is growing. So with the speed of the game growing and the demands for match play are growing, the training sessions are going to be harder because you've got to train efficiently. So this was a good one by Stevie Dewey down in Queensland. Looked at how the probability of hamstring injuries changes when you alter your weekly high-speed running sessions and your volume that you're doing week to week, right? And obviously it seems like a no-brainer, but it's a good illustration because it shows you how, like, the magnitude of that increase of probability of hamstring injuries. So this is just the baseline of 4 weeks of what that player would normally do, and when you add a couple more high-speed running sessions that week, they can bounce up to quite a high probability, right? However, probably the good part about this illustration is if you do taper back or deload back, there's actually no change really of the probability of hamstring injuries. I think this is good, and it's very important for us as practitioners because we're doing a lot of this planning and periodization. So just to have this knowledge in your back of your mind that when you do those acquisition weeks or big heavy weeks, that you may be putting them in this area, which is fine, but you have to understand that. But when you do deload, they're probably, and this is, we're only talking about one injury, they're probably in a safer spot. And then with this study, the majority of those hamstring injuries came from match play rather than training. This is a good quote I wanted to take out of it because it's not conclusive by any means, but it does raise, for me, one or two questions. Are those players training too hard in the week that they're going to be more exposed to injuries during match play, and that's why they're all coming match play? Or are they not training hard enough and not exposing themselves enough, and then when they do get exposed to max velocity, something goes? So just questions, and these are questions that I'm going to continuously ask throughout the presentation because if this does occur in your environment, these are some things that you need to ask to understand a bit better of the background of those injuries. This slide I'm just going to touch on real quick, but it was a fairly large study that involved 508 athletes over 31 teams about where hamstring injuries were coming from, but this was done 10 years ago, so just note that. They looked at a bunch of, it was PTs, and they looked at a bunch of variables surrounding soccer and surrounding some testing. They looked at to see if any of these variables had a correlation with hamstring injuries. So they used counter movement jumps, 2 40-meter sprint tests, a Nordic hamstring test, a hamstring length measurement, and then a questionnaire. And the questionnaire was pretty basic, like what's the age of the player, what's the position of the player, and have they had a previous hamstring injury. So basic stuff you would ask. They found that had no correlation. In fact, none of the really objective measures had any correlation. The biggest one with the correlation there in a univariate analysis was a questionnaire. And again, it seems like a no-brainer because the questionnaire was involved was, have they had a previous hamstring injury before? Yes or no? And if they had, they're at a greater risk. Seems like common sense, but it was quite interesting that all these were ruled out because 5 years later, all these came back into play. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So other potential causes, because I've only really spoken about speed there in that one. So other potential causes, strength programming, obviously all the variables surrounding strength programming. Are you doing it effectively? Are you overtraining? Are you undertraining? Etc. The questionnaires, are you doing them? Are you not doing them? Pre and post testing, are you testing all the variables that need to be tested? And then these are two big ones that often go overlooked. Cohesion with stakeholders. Are your departments working together? Is there a culture at the club where your PTs are working in unison with the strength coaches? And even so, up and above, is the message getting down from strength coaches? I was talking to someone earlier that they can't get players to lift in the gym because the head coach isn't pushing the sessions. I mean, that could be a serious problem when it comes to hamstring injuries. And you may have nothing to do with it, but that often goes overlooked. Same thing with return to play continuum. Are your PTs, is there a nice transition, or is it just black and white with grey areas in the middle? And then obviously load management, I won't talk about that because that's a whole GPS heart rate conversation for a different day. So far so good. Stop me at any point if I'm start rattling these off. Okay, part two, what do we know about hamstrings? What do we know about the posterior chain in general? Obviously the most basic anatomy slide of all time. Hamstrings, what are they? Where are they? Which ones are involved? I keep walking in front of you, sorry about that. So, the contributors with hamstrings, just hamstrings in general, running, moving, kicking, everything. These are kind of the stakeholders involved. So you obviously have your bicep fem, your big money maker here, which is your big lateral belly looking muscle. And then just medial to that, your semitendinosus, and then the little guy in there, semimembranosus. So the bicep fem actually has a long head and short head, but we're really just going to talk about the long head stuff. And then proximal to that, the glute complex, and then distal to that, just your gastroc and calf group. But really I'm just going to hone in on this. And this is important to note because, like I said in that video, that player is grabbed right there, bicep fem area, but he's really grabbed kind of the distal range. And it's important to know that and understand that because we're going to start to look at why and where these are coming from. So what else do we know about a posterior chain? This was a great one, study done in Japan last year, and I reference it a lot. But it looks at kind of the two big mechanisms or movement patterns in linear running. Again, this translates to any sport. So acceleration, this is max acceleration, and then maximum velocity exposure, right? And then it's just put an EMG on these two biggest muscle groups, so your bicep fem and your semitendinosus, and then looked at the gait and where the excitation levels were throughout that gait in the sprinting. Right, so this was the big takeaways from this, is in the acceleration, kind of that mid to late swing, you can see a little bit more excitation levels from the semitendinosus in comparison to the bicep fem. But more importantly, when you look at max velocity, look at the demand of the semitendinosus in that mid swing in comparison to the bicep fem. Okay, again, important to note because the semitendinosus is a smaller muscle compared to the bicep fem long head, except there's a much greater demand here when we're looking at this kind of early to mid leg swing when they're exposed to max velocity. Okay. So now that we know kind of where they are and what they do, which should just be a refresher really, I started to look at some of the when and wheres of the injury, kind of previous injuries that you look at. Again, this is another one, English Premier League over 2 years. This is as simple as breaking down the muscle groups in the most basic fashion, and then pre and in season. So pre and mid season of the percentage of where the distribution of injuries occurred. Now this is good. Again, it's just for you to ask questions within your organisation, because what I noted here from this one, in the pre-season, the majority of their injuries were quads. However, in season, the majority of these clubs in 2 years was all hamstrings. Not all, but 40% of it accounted for hamstrings. So again, begs me to ask one or two questions. Are the predominant injuries of hamstrings occurring in season because that's where all the games are and that's a speed of play and that's a demand on the body? Or is it something to do with some of the other low-hanging fruit, the strength? Are you just neglecting strength in season and doing it all in the pre-season? Are you trying to pull back too much and trying to just focus on performance of football and tactics or whatever and neglecting this stuff? Those are just some basic questions, but again, something that you would do within your organisation to try and understand a little bit better of your whole macrocycle periodization models. So then again, location. This is a great one, just looking at basic location of the injuries. And as I said, bicep fem accounted for about 58% of injuries, whereas semitendinosus accounted for 29%, and none in the semimembranosus. So now moving forward, let's just scrap that one and not talk about it at all. Just because these are the big guys here, and the majority of them are all intramuscular, right? So, by the way, I reference everything down the bottom. You don't need to write it down. You'll get a copy of this presentation, so you can go and look at all these. So, yeah, like I said, this one's a great quote because now it's starting to tie things together from what I was mentioning in the previous slides. It occurs in football during high-speed running and acceleration efforts. So, two things that were looked at in the EMG study, and then the majority of them happen in bicep fem. Take a quick breather. So, this one was almost a groundbreaking study in terms of hamstrings in sports. And it was done by Ryan Timmins and company down at ACU, the Aussies down there. Most of the stuff I reference is from Australia, and maybe it's biased, but so this one was done by all these lads, and they kind of came to a conclusion, and it's right there in the title, that the two risk factors associated with hamstring injuries in elite football, you question whether it's elite because it's Australian, but in elite football were short fascicle lengths from the bicep fem and weak eccentric knee flexor strength, right? So they looked at the short fascicle lengths by looking at the muscle, the tissue, the fascicle under ultrasound, looking at the superficial aponeurosis and deep aponeurosis, and then looking at pronation angle, and it's just basic trigonometry from there. Now I understand that probably not a lot of people in the room could do this, but some of the results from here you can take away from. Or if you can do this, speak to me later because I have a project for you. So what was analysed, these three categories were analysed. Eccentric knee flexor strength, which was done on the handy Nord board over in the corner over there. Between limb and balance, which you get from the Nord board because there's two hooks looking at the strength output of each limb. And then the fascicle head length, which was done under ultrasound by a physiotherapist. So what were some of the results here? Some of the groundbreaking results. Short fascicles. So under the ultrasound, short fascicles. You can see this curve. They're split it into two groups. You can see in the legend, if you can read that, is with athletes that have had a previous hamstring injury before and players that haven't, right? So you can see both groups showed this power law relationship, if you will, this slope. But regardless, like I said, even if you've had a hamstring injury, you can see it go down as your fascicle is longer for the bicep fem long head, right? And they found that but where there was a larger increment of hamstring injuries occurring, we're around 10.5, 10.6 centimeters. Again, you're probably not going to measure this in your own organisation, but it's good to know because there's other ways to identifying short fascicle lengths, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I hope you're following so far. And then weaker during the Nord board test, weaker during this. So eccentric knee flexor strength, exactly same relationship. Kind of the big increment there of rate of injury was around 307 newtons of force, which was an average of either limb. And then obviously, like the study done 10 years ago, older players are more susceptible to injury. It's something we can't change, that's a non-modifiable, but again, a question you should ask in your organisation, are you going to treat your athletes differently because you're older? The answer should be yes. So the message from that, get them long and strong. Get the bicep fems long and strong. Get the posterior chain long and strong. You can see the majority of all the hamstring injuries, 40% were from weak and short players. Of course, there was a couple of outliers over there, but if we know this in the back of your mind, we know this, that should play a huge role in your program. So another great one, Timmins did a year later, is, okay, everyone knows that, let's get them long and strong. But now we're starting to creep into the part 3, the how. How do we do it? So this one was really quite good, looking at the architectural change in a bicep fem long head with the two modes of training. So obviously as a strength coaches in the room know the contractile forces. You got eccentric, concentric, isometric, just as your basic ones. Not looking at isometric at all, but just kind of the two big ones is eccentric versus concentric. And what that does to fascicle length. So you can see the two groups in this study, the eccentric group and concentric group, trained and untrained. Maybe don't worry about that for the minute because the consensus there is that in the eccentric only group, by eccentrically training your hamstrings, what happens after 2 weeks? You can get upwards of a 2 centimeter increase in fascicle length, which we already know from a decade of research that is going to help prevent hamstring injuries just by increasing fascicle length. And it can be done by eccentric only. On the contrary to that, the concentric group, you can even shorten them by 1, even potentially 2 centimeters, which would in fact put them at risk, right? After 2 weeks, all it takes is 2 weeks. So again, something to note. I'm not saying there's not a place for concentric exercise, because there is, but I'll talk about that in the how, but we're starting to get towards a how a little bit. Good? So now, is the movement, now we know the mode, the contractile mode is important, obviously. Is the movement important? Of course it is. So again, Matty Bourne looked at this in the same year, looking at a hip extension group and a Nordic hamstring group. So a hip extension group, so your RDLs, this was an angled RDL, 45-degree angle on like a GHD, and a Nordic hamstring group, so your knee flexor group. Okay, so one group, and then there was a control group that were asked to do nothing. I think I might have been in that group. So the two groups, so one was doing hip extension exercises only, and one was doing knee flexor exercises only. And after 10 weeks of training, the eccentric knee flexor strength both went up for both groups at roughly the same rate. Okay, yeah, you train the hamstrings, you're going to get strong, of course. However, the fascicle length increased a little more in the knee flexor group, in the hamstring group, in the Nordic group, in comparison to the hip extension group. Okay, so now we're starting to get to how you can get there. Obviously, your knee flexor is going to increase your bicep fem fascicle length at a greater rate to your hip extension group. However, does that mean there's no place for hip extension? Again, of course not, right? So this was kind of the conclusion of this study. This is each muscle group. Again, let's just forget semimembranosus, and let's almost just forget bicep fem short head for the minute, because we're only really looking at these two. This is change in volume, so hypertrophies change, and cross-sectional area, so essentially thickness of each muscle within that muscle group. So the hip extension group showed a greater change in hypertrophy in the bicep fem long head, which is almost kind of contradictory to what the, not contradictory, but interesting to add to the previous picture. In the last slide, you see the Nordic group, the knee flexor group, show greater results in the length of the tissue, of the fascia, fascicle, sorry. But the hip extension group created better thickness of that particular muscle. On the contrary, the semitendinosus had a greater thickness with the Nordic hamstring group as opposed to the hip extension group. So again, these are the two heavy hitters. So I guess the take-home message there is do both exercises, but you should know that one's going to work on another in different fashions. So this kind of raises a bit of a hypothesis for me, and maybe for everyone in the room. Hopefully the cogs are starting to turn a little bit. Is that from this, given the research of Nordics and the importance of Nordics in training programs, the biggest result is the change in volume with the semitendinosus. So going back to the basic anatomical picture, perhaps the semitendinosus being the smaller medial and somewhat deeper muscle, creating thickness of this muscle potentially acts as a protective mechanism for the bicep fem long head, which again is the most injured side. Potential. You follow? Right, let's get to the good stuff. Single man for time, half wasn't for time. Any questions so far? So I don't want to keep going if we're not on the same page. Good. Solid. Love that. Silence maybe is good for the minute. So, if you haven't got the picture of what I'm getting at, the importance of Nordics, yeah, halves the rate of hamstring injuries. Halves the rate just by having Nordics in your program. Not just by, because I'll talk about the prescription in a minute. And maybe if you don't believe me, ask the 8,500 athletes that were involved in this one. So this one just came out earlier this year. That was at Mikkel van Dijk. So now we're starting to get into some controversy and some questions that everyone should be asking, especially within their organisation. I'll give you a second to read that. But essentially what we're looking at is, yes, they do half the rate, but there's still an abundant amount of hamstring injuries that are occurring. Goes back to my very first slide. Over 13 years, there's a 4% increase yearly of hamstring injuries, but we know this already. So why are they still happening? Now with this roll bar study, which is great, they did a questionnaire for practitioners. Why aren't you applying a Nordic hamstring program in your periodization model? We all know, they all agree that yeah, it does reduce injury, right? But look down a little further. Yeah, it causes soreness. No brainer. To get strong, you've got to lift heavy. To get robust, you've got to put yourself in an uncomfortable position. And we know, working in soccer, that it's easier said than done, because you get players that just don't want to borrow it, right? But now we're in the house, I'm going to start to talk about the transition. So it's interesting to know. They're not doing it, they're not applying it because players get sore. So then I raise the question, why are they getting sore? Start to dive a little bit into the research. Why are they getting sore? These are the sets and reps models that were applied in those researches. Just take a look at those. If anyone's done Nordics, definitely take a look at those. So some of them 3x12. If you've done a Nordic hamstring exercise, yeah, already one laughing. This is gonna fucking kill you. All right, put it bluntly. Like 3 sessions per week, 3x12. That's 36 reps 3 times a week. We know that doing a Nordic curl in an eccentric fashion is very, very difficult. It should be sub-max to almost max effort. It's like doing a 1RM deadlift almost, not equivalent, but 50 times in a week. Of course they're gonna get friggin' sore, you know? So, is there some ways around that? Can we apply it in a different manner? Can we get Nordic hamstrings in your program, knowing the importance of them in a different way? Oh, so I'll throw this one in because even with those programs, they said the rate of soreness is going down. If you're working at high performance, like I said, and you've got your stakeholders in gym and head coach above you, and you say, yeah, don't worry, they'll get, in 10 weeks, they'll get less sore, no problem. If they're still sore on a Friday, you're playing on a Saturday, hand in your resume, forget it. So it is important to know, and these are some things you have to question about research also, and take the good parts and take the bad parts with it. And sometimes not always applicable, and that's why we're talking about high performance as a whole. Okay, so this one was great, only done last year by Joel Preslin, another Aussie out of OCU. Looking at 2 intervention strategies, high volume and low volume, because every practitioner wants to know what's a minimal effective dosage. How can I get the benefits without killing the guys, right? So high volume, both groups just did a standard familiarization period of 2 weeks, just getting Nordics and exposure and eccentric knee flexor strength exposure. Then one group just did a ridiculous amount of them, while the other group did 2 sets of 4, so 8 total reps per week. 8 reps a week. Hopefully you can see that, it's quite small. So over 6 weeks, the fascicle length for both groups moved at the exact same rate. Like I said, 14 days, up to 2 centimeters of increase in fascicle length, just by doing 8 reps a week. We don't know what the reps look like, and if they were all max effort or sub-max, or guys are just piss farting through it, but the average of those groups went up roughly 2 centimeters. The knee flexor strength and the output on the NORBOARD, the newtons of force, both groups went up after 6 weeks and then maintained it after 10 weeks. That actually dotted line was the low volume group. So you actually, I would suggest, I didn't see all those reps, but I would suggest that you spend a little bit more quality as opposed to just getting the 10 reps done or just getting the 8 reps done. And you could think about this from a practical setting, or the strength coach in the room, is that if you apply this rep scheme with anyone 4x10, sometimes the 4th set they're just going through it, they're just getting a 10 in, right? So you know there's probably a bit more quality, and then as a coach, if you're at a 15-to-1 ratio, you're probably watching these a little bit closer. That's what I would take away from it, and that's probably what my hypothesis would be why that resulted in the way it did. Does that make sense? So another really, really good one out of France, and it actually just came out recently in April in the IJSPP, a fantastic one. Again, looking at high volume versus low volume. So these guys, and this is where we're at in research, this was this year. These guys are now splitting the exercises up and the rep schemes up with a hip extension and a knee flex up, right? Because everyone now starts to understand the value of thickening bicep fem, lengthening bicep fem, but also thickening semitendinosus. I'm starting to try to piece these together with the previous slides, so you're starting to get the cogs turning a little bit. Again, they did a 3-week, familiarization, where they all did the same stuff, and then they were broken into 2. This one resulted in 40 total reps, so 16 from there, 24 from there. a brain fart for a minute. 24 from there, 40 total reps, hip extension and knee flexor, and this one was 10 total reps. 6 coming from the hip extension, 4 coming from the knee flexor. You can probably already guess the results. High volume versus low volume. As far as eccentric strength, knee flexor strength, both groups went up, and then he actually did a nice little comparison which group was better. Neither, right in the middle. The other big risk factor, the low hanging fruit there, ISFM, long head fascial length. Both groups went up, both groups increased from pre to mid. No group was better. Starting to see the kind of continuity between the research and where we get as 2020 comes around. So before I start getting into this, because now this is the how, this is the chunk of time I'll spend here. Is obviously we know the importance of Nordics, we know the importance of RDLs, we know the importance of eccentric strength training versus concentric, we know hip and knee and all that sort of stuff. Everyone in the research in the past 10 years is talking about, yep, Nordics, get them in. But from a practical setting, and everyone in the room are coaches or PTs, how can you apply Nordics? You just have a guy come in day one and say, okay, we're going to bang out 2x4 now because 8's the minimum effective dosage. Maybe not. You may get someone who's never seen a dumbbell in their life. I'll probably send them over the street for Ashley for a little bit and then send them back. But you may get someone who's never seen a weight in their life and you can't pop them on that exercise because it's quite demanding. So there has to be some sort of progression. And now I'm starting to get into a little more anecdotal stuff that I've identified all the research. So this is a little bit more stuff I've done over the past 4 or 5 years. Is how to get there. How to get there. And this is just one way. There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, but you have to have some, as a strength coach, it's a no-brainer, but you've got to have some progression models. But I've noted there, obviously this is just one, and we're talking about really what would be a supplementary exercise. But you still have to include strength work. You can't neglect your deadlifts, you can't neglect all that sort of stuff. This is just a supplementary work for those guys that are going to be exposed to acceleration and high speed running and high velocities, which is essentially everybody. So start with long levers. So this for me is just seeing if the athlete can get in an elongated position and hold it and be exposed to that, and then start to develop some eccentric training. And the eccentric training is pretty much low level. A lot of it's supine. You can even do manually if you're a PT, just to get them through full range and have them do it under tension and more force. And then start to do that in a single leg fashion. And then eventually you should be able to get some good integrity from Nordics. Because if you're trying to implement a Nordic training program and taking all that research that we know, and you get someone on the Nord board and they go to here and then just lose all integrity, you're not getting any benefit of that. Because the idea is to, like I was saying, and the research was saying, increase fascicle length. You're not increasing it through 10, 20 range of motion, percent of motion, right? So you have to be able to get some integrity in that. But there's obviously steps to get there. So, mind this fella, but here's some videos, some exercises that I've done. Some basic level, and then they start to go up. Like I said, this is just the long lever stuff. So basic glute bridge with a walkout, and then a little hold at the end. Some long lever glute bridges in a bilateral fashion, unilateral fashion. Again, if you're a PT, this is a good way, a return to play marker, to see if they get pain in an elongated state. So this is actually carries over to some of our end stage rehab stuff too. But I like this one a lot because this one eventually becomes a warm-up exercise for the guys, because you get a benefit of a glute bridge, a hip extension exercise, and then you get that knee flexor activity, walkout, and you can even add an ISO hold towards the end there. Some other anecdotal stuff I've done, I've looked at this on the force frame. On the force frame, looking at strength, but also looking at the rates that the force starts to decrement. So just some anecdotal stuff, but you can do that if you have access to this equipment. So far, so good. After the athletes are kind of gone through that, just looking at long levers, start to add a bit more of a dynamic fashion in an eccentric mode only, like I was saying, in an eccentric mode. just basic furniture sliders, glute bridge, and now you start to adding the whole piece to it. And then this is a lot more advanced and a lot more challenging, is doing that in the TRX, bilateral or unilateral. So once they get through that and you start to, because this one's quite challenging, if they can do that in a single leg and then hold that out there for 2 to 3 seconds, you know what's gonna happen. If they can get out there and hold that for 2 to 3 seconds, I think you would comfortably say they can start to get into the Nordics. So these are 3 Nordic exercises and their regressions. So just using a basic band in the most distal way, so with the longest lever is the easiest one to do. Then around the chest, then around the hip, and then you can get to full ones. And what you're looking for, I don't know if it's played again, but what you're looking for is the integrity of the movement. You want full range, or at least to here before you start to progress. Like I said, there has to be steps to get there. There has to be steps to utilize some of these exercises in a safe and efficient way. And then eventually you get to this. One of my athletes last year at Orlando. So we're talking about buy-in and putting guys in uncomfortable positions. We talk about buy-in. This guy was brought in. He actually didn't like doing them initially, but it came down to there's a lot of crossover here, but it came down to education and kind of telling him the benefits in a simplistic way. So this athlete in particular, when you have integrity like that and stabilization like that, you don't get like tremendous increments of strength at that point. But he started holding a 25, 35, 45 pound plate whilst doing that exercise. And then some more anecdotal stuff. So I've taken Carl Askeling's work. If you're familiar with Carl Askeling's work, using his single leg diver, which is actually a rehab exercise, a return to play exercise, and applied some different contractile forces to it, a rapid eccentric isometric. So essentially going through this RDL or single leg diver motion in a rapid, it's starting to get a little aggressive, but this is the stuff that I find creates some serious robustness with these guys, is getting to an elongated state fast and stopping on a dime, creating some dynamic response from the muscle spindles. Okay? Again, this is all anecdotal stuff. There's no research investigating this yet. But again, the same thing can be applied. Again, my stuff is pretty aggressive, but can be applied with weights and RDLs. So I'll do this with guys, obviously just eccentric, adding a little iso, long lever, and then stop. There's no concentric portion to that. And I've only had, in the past 3 to 4 years, I've only had about 3 or 4 guys total that can do that. But still very, very effective. And it's quite challenging and creates a bit of DOMS, don't get me wrong. But when I program these, because we know the value of eccentric training, when I program these, it's exactly like that. They'll go all the way down, they'll hold it, and the timing, the tempo for this exercise changes and alters, but they'll go down, they'll hold it, and they'll drop it, and I'll pick it back up and put it on the pins. So what I do want to address, though, I'm not saying there's no place for concentric training, but when it comes to supplementary exercise and posterior chain, in our sport and our demand of what we're trying to get out of players, that's how I program it. Okay, I certainly don't neglect the concentric motion of a trap bar deadlift or a straight bar deadlift, because that's bang for your buck right there, and you're talking about one of the best exercises. But that is a compound movement, a multi-joint movement that doesn't just demand the hamstrings. We're looking at single joint movements where you're asking the hamstrings to do a lot. For the most part, don't know if I say all of it, but almost all of it is going to be in an eccentric manner, because I'm trying to get them strong, trying to get the tendinosus thick, trying to get the bicep fin long. So the time and place for these, I think we're in a world now with high-speed running and everything is fairly outdated from what we know from the research. Exercise like these, where it's isolated, single joint movements, a lot of concentric exercise, and a lot of those are programmed fairly high. For me, there's no place. Very, very little. Shouldn't say no, but very, very little. Because of what we know. What we know from the contractile forces in that isolated single joint movement, you shorten the fascicle lengths over time. As short as 2 weeks, which could potentially put them at risk. So we're trying to do everything we can to put them in the safest, efficient way to get the best human performance we can from them and essentially our team, right? And for me, this has little to no place based on the decades of research that we have. So this is just some basic prescriptions that I use. Not to say they're the best or worst, but basic ones I use. Some of the sliders, the supine stuff, I'll go a little bit more with the sets and reps, especially single leg as well. Nordics, I try and do minimal effective dosage, so 2x4, 3x3. You get a little bit more effort with a 3x3 because someone's put more effort into a 3 as they would a 4, and then some stuff at a RDLZ. So again, all anecdotal. That's a lots of big question on that. That's all up for debate. But that's what I found is effective. How am I doing for time? So I just want to touch on, I have a few more slides that I want to touch on, because if you do happen to have a hamstring injury, if you do happen to be exposed to that, and I hope you don't, how do you treat that? What do you do to treat that? What are the steps? And how do we get back to doing Nordics again and getting the bang for our buck? How do we get back to doing trap bar deadlifts and straight bar squatting and everything we need to be doing? So this is probably the most notable or famous hamstring return to play protocol, which is done by Carl Askling a long time ago, which is using these 3 activities. You saw the diver in the video. I do it a little bit more aggressive, but the extender, just lying on your back and kicking, a diver and a glider. Now again, going back, I'm starting to tie everything together, but going back to the first slide, Carl Askling worked in a private facility whilst doing this, and this was his protocol. This was every day, this was every second day, this was every third day. That was his hamstring return to play protocol, and he compared it to another stretching protocol. And he did find, by using that protocol, they get back a lot faster, as opposed to just the other one, that L protocol that was C protocol, that was the stretching mechanism. However, he's in a private facility, doesn't have a GM and head coach and everyone barking down him, and his mean return to play from these injuries was 21 to 22 days. So it's just something to note, 21 to 22 days using that protocol only. However, some people started to pull some of this stuff out of Sweden, done in 1997, using a pain scale of prescribing exercises using a pain scale, and looking at the groups of pain tolerance and no pain at all throughout exercise. This is more kind of PT stuff. And then Jack Hickey, a lad from ACU back in Melbourne as well, kind of took that pain scale and applied it to return to play clearance for hamstrings. So bicep fem, long head fascicle length for both groups, pain-free and pain threshold. So the pain threshold were players that could tolerate pain up to 4 out of 10 on that previous scale and still maintain integrity in the movement. And the pain-free was people who had pain and they stopped. So if they have pain, do you stop and regress, or do you use a threshold to kind of push them back? So there was really no difference when the return to play clearance as far as bicep fem long head fascicle. However, after 2 months of follow-up, the one that would push a little further in the early stages of rehab, up to a 4 out of 10 pain scale, actually illustrated a greater bicep fem long head fascicle length after 2 months. So the risk of re-injury were lower by pushing them in the early stages. Again, I keep harping on it. My stuff is aggressive, but here's some heavy hitters here when it comes to return to play. And as we looked at before, the risk of injury increased about 10.5, after 2 months, this player still maintained at least 10.5 centimeters. Does that make sense? As opposed to not being there. So another important thing is like I said earlier, we're talking a lot about Nordics and stuff and how to get there. It's incredibly important for cohesion within departments to create something like this, an exercise menu and progressions to how to get there, some pain thresholds to how to tick and get them forward. This is something that we've used as our department. Is that even these early stage exercises, like the one I was showing you in the video, they just become a warm-up exercise for the guys later on that are dominating stage 2 and stage 3. Does that make sense? But there's always a time and place for these. Doesn't mean once they're done, they move forward. But there's obviously a ton of variables that need to be taken into account when progressing them back in a return to play setting. That might be a bit deeper conversation that you can ask me about later. All right, I'm starting to wrap it up. So some key takeaways. Yeah, get long and strong. Implement progressions, regressions. Harp on them, hit on them. Have a return to play continuum. Have some cohesion within departments. Have some cohesion with the coaching panel. Try and avoid going backwards because that's the one thing that'll cost you your job. And obviously, I did mention pain threshold and stuff like this. Safety first. We're all here trying to put our athletes in a safe and effective environment, and we're trying to drive high performance. That's it. That's all I got. There we go for time. Pretty good. If anyone has any questions now, I'll take them. Otherwise, I'll ask them later. Yeah.
Alex, I've got one for you. I know your program, you talk about Nordics a lot. Do you use any variations like razor or isometric type of work, especially like on a Nord board, you can do like ISO 30. Do you do that, or you see that beneficial? If you do,
I'll
where
do
you
that.
program?
I looked at some of those. I looked at some of those earlier. I showed some of those earlier, rather in the slide. Because of the demand and the DOMs that Nordics can result in, ISOs, yeah, there's a good place for ISOs. But for me, I do them at a long lever because we're trying to test force. The two heavy hitters were force and being long. So I test that in a long lever. So I'll have guys do a double leg glute bridge on there in a long lever fashion and have them hold it and then look at force. I've exported the data, and now I'm getting a bit nerdy with it, but I've exported the data and applied a smooth moving average to it to see if there was a difference with the left and right, especially with return to play guys. I feel like there's a big time and place for that. But yeah, apart from that, like we know the mechanisms of the eccentric work and strengthening under force and what it does. So that would be kind of my first go-to in terms of strengthening and injury prevention. If that answers your question.
Yeah, you do it in season, preseason, or combination of both?
Both.
Okay.
Everywhere. Yeah. It's hard, but trying to apply some of the research. I feel like the off season is the time for that familiarization phase where you want to do a little bit more because they're not running, they're not doing anything else other than, well, depends where your organisation is, but they're not doing much other than lifting. They're not playing games rather. So that's the time for me for the familiarisation phase. Not just for Nordics, but like exposing them to a lot of the supine stuff, exposing them to a lot of deadlifts, exposing them to a lot of just strength modalities in general. So then when they do come to pre-season, you can continue that. And if they haven't done it, yeah, they're kind of shit out of luck, but to continue that protocol in season 2, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Have you found a value using NordBoard that kind of proves to be like the baseline kind of for like injury prevention? So if there's is there a reason to push past a certain value? You've kind of got classical length and strength in that Nordic hamstring, so that way you can kind of not necessarily progress because it'll be more sore later. Kind of get to like a certain limit to where you can like, okay, maintain this instead of kind of increasing the load to where I'm more sore throughout the rest of the season. Decrease that probability of soreness?
Yeah. I mean, the literature says around 337 is a good range to prevent it from that. So if players are coming in, they'll often do a pre-screening test where they all do it to max effort. And for me, I set a performance marker at around 400. You'd want them to be at 400 to be safe. And if they aren't, maybe they have some more slides and stuff in their pre-out protocol that the ATs and PTs will do, but it's a recommendation. But if they are, yeah, for sure you maintain that. And like Ashley was saying, if they're, I guess, strong enough in that area, there's obviously other areas to work on. They'll do the minimal effective dosage, but also in their supplementary, instead of having 3 or 4 sets of a hip extension exercise, maybe there's something else to work on. But as far as maintaining, yeah, I try and shoot for 400. That's just me. I'd rather overshoot it than undershoot it and be caught in a bad conversation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, like, instead of trying to push past a certain threshold that causes more, I guess, discomfort and
Yeah.
soreness from possibility of entering into like become a player or during a game, there's just some threshold to maintain that they don't have to necessarily be sore. I just maintain sort of the effective dose. So push past
Yeah,
it.
even we've been in scenarios even where guys are sore from games and we have a short turnaround, and you really can't program Nordics in that week for that reason because guys will be sore. I just refer to some of the regressions and put those something that maybe you can't measure, but maybe do 3 sets of a supine slide instead. That'll help maintain it, but it'll create a lot less soreness because they're exposed to a lot less force. Does that make sense? But yeah, if you have a 7-day turnaround, I try and program them early so that they're not sore by Saturday.
Oh, it's a great presentation, thank you. So I want to start the season without hamstring injuries. So what are you doing beforehand as a functional tool or measurement to make sure that you start the season without hamstring injuries?
Shit, that's a loaded question. It depends what environment you're in. If you have every player in the off season and every player in your facility, then start getting them exposed to that and get them exposed to soreness because they're not playing. So then when season does come, they've gone through the adaptations and hopefully they have long fascicle lengths and high knee flexor strength. But if not, you're just getting guys in preseason. I would try and evaluate them as soon as possible, and then break the players into categories. Guys that are low go into almost like a flags group, if you will, and guys that are high just continue with one strength protocol. And if these guys need to do more exposure to it, something's always got to give, but maybe an upper body exercise is taken out from these guys, and you're applying some single leg eccentric work, and then you retest later in the preseason. I would say the goal would be by season starts to try and completely minimise it. Is you're hitting every category, you're doing everything you can within your realm. But you have some objective markers along the way, and that would be for me everyone trying to hit 400 plus with integrity, and being able to still do hip extension work and stuff like that. If that makes sense.
Yes, follow up to that. So in your setting, you bring in a new player, and he has a history of a hamstring injury. What's your assessment tool to make sure he doesn't come up with another hamstring injury?
I mean, the questionnaire is a good starter. If they've had a hamstring injury, where it occurred, when it occurred, how it occurred, because that's also important. Did it occur high speed run? Did it occur kicking? Did it occur reaching? How do you stop him? Just trying to get him robust as possible. Well, it's almost the same protocol for both if you're injured, not injured, because you know that they both groups will still get that benefit from getting long and strong. But yeah, it kind of just rolls in and out. Get them long and strong. If they have, you just need a little bit more care, maybe a little bit more reps in different fashions, not necessarily Nordics, but different fashions. And maybe overall robustness. Maybe the primary, because what we're talking about is a supplementary block. Maybe prime movers needs to be heavy hit too, because I'm only talking about a little piece that apply, but overall strength and overall robustness is obviously important too. So presuming they have all that, then the supplementary work, I'd probably just spend a little bit more time with those individuals. Especially even the older ones too, to carry. Even the older ones almost fall into that category too, because they're going to be. We already know that older players are going to have a higher probability of